Good morning, I'm Neil Stratford. I'm the chairman of the trustees of the Corpus. I am giving the annual Corpus lecture in place of the director of the Corpus, Xavier Dacto, who is unable to lecture as was planned. It's a great honour and pleasure for me to do this, and I thought that I would give you this lecture in the hope that you'll ask questions of a really basic kind about the Romanesque capital. So I've called the lecture The Paradox of the Romanesque Capital in Burgundy, principally centering on two monuments, Cluny and Vézelay. The lecture will last probably, I think, about 1 hour. Most of us would argue that the 11th and 12th centuries were among the most inventive of periods, and that one of the most original of these inventions, and I use the word in broad terms, was the figured capital. There are a few surviving figured capitals from classical antiquity and the early Middle Ages, but it seems, and there's general agreement on this point I think, that it was in the years just before the year 1000 and in the decades which followed, that the taste for embellishing the capital with figures, human or animal or fantastic, was developed. And I show you here the famous capital at Ziflich on the Dutch-German border, so like the Gero crucifix of about 960. The Ziflich capital is reused from a lost former building. Between the last years of the 11th century and the first decades of the 12th century, the fashion for the figured capital became well established, at least in the important monasteries. Here, the Moissac cloister of 1100, and a detail of one of the figured capitals, Daniel in the Lion's Den. Burgundy was one of the most innovative of all the regions in respect of the Romanesque capital. This lecture poses the paradox of the Romanesque capital. We'll be looking particularly at two buildings, Cluny 3, and I show you one of the great choir capitals with the 4 trees and the 4 rivers of paradise. The huge church was begun in 1088 by Abbot Hugh of Saumur, St. Hugh, and before that I will speak of the nave of Vézelay. Vézelay was one of Cluny's greatest dependencies in the time of the construction of the nave and its facade, about 1120 to 1135, by St. Hugh's nephew Renaud de Saumur. The nave of Vézelay boasts one of the richest displays of Romanesque capitals which have come down to us. The fashion for decorating the capital with figures was in fact short-lived. The advent of Gothic architecture, as we like to call it, first in the Ile-de-France and later diffused throughout Europe, saw the rejection of the figured capital, a marked preference for the foliage capital, for example, the crocket capital, or in England, the waterleaf capital and the stiffleaf capital. Rejection of the figured capital was by no means universal and occurred at different periods in different regions, for instance, very late in Catalonia. But by the middle of the 13th century, the rejection was pretty well total. Thus, the figured capital was a passing fashion, enduring in the most important buildings no more than about a century, or perhaps a little more. In context, it must also be remembered that by no means all, indeed rather few Romanesque churches were decorated with a rich variety of figured capitals. In some regions, it was the rule, even in parish churches. For instance, in the west of France, but it was far from being universally the norm. The richly decorated churches could be monastic, they could be cathedrals, as here in the Cathedral of St. Maurice at Vienne in the Middle Rhone Valley, of, I think, the second quarter of the 12th century. Occasionally, even parish churches are decorated with a few figured capitals, and these capitals can be found in the sanctuary, or the nave, or the narthex, or the cloister. Why then in some churches and not in others? Was it just a question of money and or the availability of a competent sculptor? But in some cases, as for instance at Nantua, a rich and important priory of Cluny in the mountains to the northeast of Lyon, a conscious choice seems to have been made, and we're about 1170 to 80, I think, to refuse the figured capital, and this is a church with a very richly decorated west door. This refusal does not necessarily imply austerity, and certainly not Cistercian influence, I believe, as is sometimes claimed. The Cathedral of Langres is lavishly decorated, but there are almost no figures to be seen anywhere, and there are other cases of this. For instance, here at Paris-le-Monial, an important priory of Cluny in the Brionnais, simple foliage capitals, or more or less plain leaf capitals, outnumber figured capitals, even around the main altar. This is one of the apse capitals. And on the few figured capitals at Paris, birds and beasts are found. These capitals are not historiated. In the nave at Vézelay, there are no less than 99 capitals, 3 on each pier of the arcades. One group of capitals on each side beneath the transverse arches which span the huge space. The majority are figured, and there are another 53 capitals in the narthex. In the nave alone, 32 capitals are decorated with foliage, without figures. The facades, each with 3 portals, on the exterior and interior of the narthex, also have sets of capitals. The extraordinary thing is that none of this vast assembly of capitals seems to be organised as part of a sequence, narrative or symbolic or decorative. How do we explain this? Are we missing something? Or are we searching for something which was never there? We are faced with a phenomenon which defies our 21st century logic. As Descartes says, c'est quasi le même de converser avec ceux des autres siècles que de voyager. Speaking to other centuries is almost like taking a journey. The first problem which faces a contemporary audience is how to read the message which the sculptor intended to convey. At Vézelay, inscriptions sometimes identify the scene on the capital. Normally they're inscribed on the abacus, but they could also be painted on the abacus, or even on the half column beneath, and no doubt many are lost. And I show you here a drawing turned into an engraving in a published book with a Vézelay capital, bottom left, with the remains of the painted inscription on the half column beneath. This has paved the way to many disputable readings given to the nave capitals at Vézelay, the fact that so many inscriptions are lost. But art historians, some more convincing than others, by art historians, some more convincing than others. Let us begin with a famous example, which has caused much ink to flow. On the first pier of the south arcade, facing the aisle, is the so-called capital of the Rape of Ganymede. Its neighbours, and there are two views of the capital here, one taken from the right, one straight on. Its neighbours present a combat between two exotic creatures, which I show you, and a second capital, now replaced by a modern pastiche, showed musical animals. These were the neighbours. A foliage capital is set on the respond in the aisle facing the capital in question. It was Jean Adhémar who first proposed that what's shown here is the episode of Jove's appearance in the guise of an eagle, taking off the beautiful young Ganymede, who with his javelin and his dogs was hunting stags on Mount Ida, after Virgil's lines in Book 5 of the Aeneid. But on the Vézelay capital there is no Mount Ida. The man in the eagle's talons has no javelin. There is only one dog and no stags. On the other hand, the aged guardians of the young man, who are mentioned in Virgil's hexameters, could perhaps be shown in a group of mutilated figures on the left side of the capital, as well as in the bald man on the left of the left slide, the bald man raising his hands in anguish. There is, however, one fundamental objection to Adhémar's interpretation. A devil, a totally un-Virgilian image reserved to Christian iconography, is shown on the right face of the capital. Widely accepted as a 12th century rendering of the Rape of Ganymede, the capital has even led to the suggestion that the scene represents a moral warning to the monastic community of Vézelay against the sin of homosexuality. This hypothesis can be easily refuted. The capital is set on the first pier of the South Arcade, in a public area, given over to the laity, not in the area of the monks' choir. Perhaps all that can be said with certainty is that the devil's presence suggests some sort of diabolical vision, nothing to do with Ganymede. The presence of demons is a constant and accepted fact of life in Peter the Venerable's De Miraculis, compiled at Cluny in the 1130s and 40s, where their physical appearance is often graphically described. It is as such a vision that Werner Weisbach long ago interpreted the capital, and I quote, "The master of the Vézelay capital has borrowed a formal motif, one which is in fact frequent, an eagle holding an animal in its claws, and has adapted it to his group with a suitable meaning referring to the Christian world of the imagination." Such a reading of the capital rightly rejects the scenario of a learned monk who knows his Virgil, commissioning a sculptor to present a Virgilian theme on a pier in the nave, a space occupied by the predominantly unlettered laity, who indeed would have understood a Ganymede capital. So many of the Vézelay nave capitals are enigmatic in subject matter, difficult to understand. They've become a happy hunting ground for art historians, where moral intentions and hidden meanings, like hieroglyphs, as Dorothea and Peter Damer said, can be unearthed at will. But it is not the proper business of the art historian to impose on the 12th century spectator a reading of a Romanesque capital, unless there is physical evidence from the image itself that the sculptor intended to convey such and such a message. Of course, the historical context is all important here. To quote R.G. Collingwood, "You are thinking historically when you say about something, I see what the person who made this, wrote this, used this, designed this, etc., was thinking. Until you can say that, you may be trying to think historically, but you are not succeeding. The art historian's role is to analyse the capital itself. In doing so, he may from time to time identify a symbolic or allegorical intention, or perhaps a typological parallel. But to assume that there must be a secondary, or indeed several layers of meaning, is to stray down a dangerous path. A whole range of subject matter which has been widely regarded as carrying a secondary intellectual message must be treated with extreme caution. From grotesque masks to animals and exotic creatures, to purely vegetal compositions, even Corinthians. A capital of the hemicycle at Cluny could have been seen as a reference by analogy to antiquity, to the period of Christ's life, or to the Church of Rome. But this can only be deduced as a possibility from the well-known circumstances of Cluny's relationship with Rome and the papacy. The capital here, decorated with the age-old motif of interlace, a motif out of date by the 12th century, was carved to decorate the apse of the Cistercian Abbey of Flaron in the Gers. It may have evoked for the monks the wish of the Cistercian order to return to the well springs of early monasticism. But this is a pure assumption, even if a credible one. The pendulum swings. By the middle of the 19th century, symbolic interpretations of Romanesque sculpture were widely accepted. The Abbé Cronier was a leading practitioner of this vogue, which has never entirely gone away and is now enjoying a new lease of life, for instance across the Atlantic. I show you here a charming capital at Mozart in the Auvergne, an abbey of Cluny, with two centaurs, whose antique pedigree is obvious. They flank a central foliage element. It is not, as has recently been claimed, a symbolic representation of the tree of life. It is a corliculus, which has emigrated from its usual role as part of the Corinthian capital. An extreme protagonist of the symbolic can even head the first chapter of her book, Le Sens d'un enseignement, the direction of teaching. This position is, of course, a reference to Gregory the Great's famous defence of images. Art in the church is there to instruct the Gentiles and the illiterate. Gregory's letters in defence of images became standard fare. For instance, in the 13th century Middle German poem Der Welsche Gast, and I quote, "From the painted image, the peasant and the child will often derive pleasure. He who cannot understand what by reading a man of excellence knows how to understand will satisfy himself with images." But Gregory is referring to representations of biblical and sacred stories, not theological ideas. The contemporary search for further meanings behind images goes far beyond Gregory's defence. What's more, there's a wish to identify programs which govern a particular area of the building or explain a whole group of capitals. One of the most grounded of contemporary art historians, Kitri Kaz, is capable of describing the Moissac cloister, which we saw at the beginning, as cette œuvre intellectuelle majeure, this major intellectual work of art. Symbolic interpretations of Romanesque art are sometimes justified, of course, as Émile Malle knew only too well. But they come with a built-in danger of over-interpretation. Malle was writing from his study, surrounded by published texts. He was a bibliophile. He had in mind such widely diffused texts as the Bestiary, with its popularized Latin version of the Physiologus. But an image is not a text, and when there's a text which corresponds to an image, it so often fails to explain it. A capital carved to decorate a Romanesque church is not to be read as a text. There are occasions, undoubtedly, where a symbolism can be attached to a capital, above all when it's placed beneath an image on a portal. Here is Saint-Loup-de-Neau in Champagne. Siren harpies are, for instance, frequently carved on the capitals of early Gothic portals with column figures in Champagne. In this context, the siren is interpreted as a symbol of malign forces. But even here, acceptance of such an interpretation is difficult. The harpy has an incredibly wide presence and diversity in Romanesque art. And at Saint-Loup-de-Neau, harpy capitals and a griffin accompany the column figures, as you see. Should these be read as a representation of the forces of evil, contributing to the message of the portal above, which is dominated by the Majestas Domini, the tympanum? To quote Émile Malle, nos sculpteurs ne pensaient pas toujours à instruire. La plupart du temps, ils ne songeaient qu'à décorer. Voilà ce qu'il importe d'établir. Our sculptors were not always thinking to instruct. Most of the time, they only dreamed of decorating. That is what is important for me to establish. That's Émile Malle. In other cases, and here it's impossible to make a truly objective judgment, an element of humour seems to be introduced. For how else, at Autun, here, should we read this naked youth eating fruit among the rich foliage of a capital? But laughter for an audience of another age and another place is more than difficult for us to gauge. It can at best be guessed at. As to narrative scenes, many indeed episodes which have been taken from a larger narrative, Gospels for instance, they too have been seen over and over again as representing, beyond their narrative content, a deeper and more complex web of ideas, a further meaning, hidden in certain cases. A very small repertoire of texts do indeed imply that art could on occasions carry a further meaning. However, there is an even greater body of evidence suggesting that art was not by any means considered in such a light by contemporaries. This is even true when its context, for example in a church or in a manuscript with the sacred text, might have been expected to encourage the creation of an intellectual image. To quote Lucas of Tuy, Lucas de Tuy, I quote, "Images are painted and carved in Christ's church, some in defence of the faith, to teach, to imitate, and to decorate, to the benefit of the faithful, others in similar fashion to teach, imitate, and decorate, others simply for decoration." And he goes on, "In the church there are painted figures of beasts, of winged creatures, of serpents and other things, whose only role is to ornament and to beautify. For it is just that everything should figure in the cult which is represented in the church, and that the Creator of all things should be celebrated in all his works. Lucas was Bishop of Twi from 1239 to about 1249, and he was writing in 1235 to 7 in his treatise De Altera Vita against the Albigensian heresy in Leon. There is no clearer or more unambiguous contemporary statement on the role of art in the Church of the Romanesque period. As with Theophilus, it is the beauty of God's house, in the words of David the psalmist, which governs the purpose of art. Another capital in the nave at Vézelay, the famous capital of the mystic mill, is a good place from which to launch any discussion of the paradox of the Romanesque capital. Towards the end of the 19th century, the subject matter of the capital was identified, and this is very well known, thanks to a description of a lost stained glass window by Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis. And I quote, "One of these windows, urging us onward from the material to the immaterial, represents the Apostle Paul turning a mill and the prophets carrying sacks to the mill. The verses of this subject are these: By working the mill thou, Paul, takest the flour out of the bran, thou makest known the innermost meaning of the law of Moses. From many grains is made the true bread without bran, our and the angels' perpetual food." Sensitive to many different possible levels of interpretation of the capital and its audience, long ago in an article, Michel Zinc led the reader far beyond the obvious message of the capital, its typological message, the relationship between the grain of the old law of Moses and the milled flour of the New Testament, passed on. At the centre of the composition is the cross, a cross which forms the mill wheel from which St. Paul fills his sack with the refined flour of the new law. Zinc's intellectual journey is firmly anchored in the culture of the period when the capital was made, and he never strays into the path of modern psychoanalytical speculation. Yet a nagging doubt persists, at least for me, a doubt about purpose and context. Was this learned work of art intended for an unlettered audience in a society where oral tradition predominated? Of course, there's no intention here to equate the oral culture of the 12th century with a culture of ignorance. Far from it. But is it enough to evoke sermons and preaching as a means of communication which would have made learned allusions familiar to an unlettered audience? How was the capital's message conveyed? Why is the capital where it is, on the fourth pier of the south nave arcade, that is, in the nave of the laity, not, for instance, in the monks' choir, or in the cloister? Can we assume that a learned monk could be summoned as commentator on occasion to explicate such an image? Such an explanation involves special pleading, but perhaps that is indeed the explanation. In any case, the mystic mill is by no means the only learned capital to have found a place in the nave of the laity. There's a notion that there's a coherent programme, or perhaps even a number of programmes, which governed the genesis of the nave capitals. This, I think, can be dismissed as flying directly in the face of the evidence. There are no groups of capitals thematically related in specific areas of the nave, nor are there recognisable sequences of capitals. Even narrative sequences are almost totally absent. It's a remarkable fact, for instance, that biblical sequences do not exist. Two capitals, which can be viewed from a single point of view, do not, in spite of claims to the contrary, seem to present coherent messages. Here on the left, a miracle of St. Benedict. On the right, Daniel in the lion's den. The same can be said for other theories. It's been claimed that certain areas of the nave are devoted to overall themes, or that a flow of ideas can be discerned from one area to another. This is to stretch the actual evidence far beyond reality. The starting point is always the same: the necessity to identify a programme, for it seems inconceivable that there is no programme. The hypothesis is then bolstered by selected examples of capitals which support the construction of the hypothesis. The examples which do not support it are not taken into account. Other figured capitals and the numerous foliage capitals are not even mentioned, as if they're not there. However, there are other possible explanations which can be advanced to explain at least in part this apparent pell-mell of capitals. These explanations are unsatisfactory because unprovable, but they must be mentioned. First, the nave of Vézelay was undoubtedly intended to be painted. There is overwhelming evidence that wall paintings were distributed here and there in the interior of such buildings. Indeed, vestiges of Romanesque wall painting survive in the tribunes of the narthex at Vézelay. Such decoration was always conceived from the start as a fundamental part of the building. Great painted cycles, as in the nave of Saint-Savin-sur-Courtauld, so well known, may perhaps have been exceptional. We can't be sure about that. But that there were images isolated or in groups, almost like posters painted on the walls, is certain. Could the mystic mill have been conceived to comment on a scene painted nearby, on the vaults of the adjacent aisle bay, or on the intrados of the arch of the arcade it faced? For instance, a cycle of scenes from the life of St. Paul, as in the little chapel at Canterbury, which I show you, with St. Paul and the miracle of the viper. Secondly, and again this is an unknown factor, altars were probably adossed to some of the nave piers. The late 17th century plan of Cluny III, which I show you, published by Dom Mabillon, illustrates this liturgical phenomenon. I hope you can see them. They're in the nave of Cluny III. There were altars adossed to the piers in the Mabillon plan. We do not know at what date these altars were erected, but could an altar have been set up below the capital of the Mystic Mill, with a dedication related to the theme of the capital? An altar dedicated to St. Paul, for instance. It's thus possible that in certain instances a capital was placed in position as a marginal comment on a painting or an altar. Again, the liturgy could determine the place of a capital, the position of a capital. At Vézelay, it's a striking fact that a set of 11th century capitals was trimmed and reused in the east bays of the 12th century nave, in the area of the new monks' choir. Here is one of the reused early capitals, Daniel between the lions. You can see, I hope, where the necking band has been cut down to fit it into its new context. This reuse of earlier capitals was done, it seems, not so much for their subject matter as for their resonance to tradition, their reference to the old choir, which had just been extended into the newly built nave. No doubt certain capitals in other buildings could be seen to reflect, for instance, the position of the choir screen, if that position was known to us. It may also be that processional routes could sometimes explain the position of a capital, as very probably here at Plainpied in the Barberie. The great church was built in the late 11th and early 12th centuries for a community of eremitical canons regular, following one of the rules of St. Augustine. We know from a charter that the monastery was founded by an Archbishop of Bourges for a group of the cathedral chapter who were not happy with the urban life they led and wished to withdraw into the desert in the spirit of the early church fathers. In the second quarter of the 12th century, when the nave was constructed, the famous capital which I show you, of the Temptation of Christ, was carved and set on the last pier. This is the plan of the pier, on the last pier of the south arcade, next to the crossing, and you can see a small doorway facing it. As the canons left their cloister to enter the choir, they were faced on the nave pier opposite the cloister door with the scene of Christ in the desert, tempted by two devils. The position of the capital can be no accident. At Vézelay, however, processions in no way explain the setting of the nave capitals, in spite of recent claims to the contrary. Indeed, throughout Western Europe, examples of a carefully considered position for a capital seem to be extremely rare. There's another exception to this generalization, one that applies not only to the nave but to the eastern parts of churches, not, however, to cloisters or indeed chapter houses. This time it seems that purely formal or architectural considerations were at work. Since late antiquity, there was a tradition, still apparent to this day, for instance in some of the surviving basilicas in Rome, where capitals in pairs were placed antiphonally on either side of the main vessel of the church, one corresponding to the other. Each member of the pair could be virtually identical, or the two capitals could correspond in a more general way, but they were clearly intended to be seen as a pair. This tradition no doubt originated as an aesthetic decision, but it had the advantage that, within the workshop, the second capital of the pair could be copied from the first, allowing, for instance, for the intervention of a second sculptor. The tradition of pairs had remarkable stamina, enduring throughout the early Middle Ages, and only finally evaporating towards the end of the 12th century. Its underlying influence can be felt in many buildings, and we'll return to it with the apse of Cluny 3, but it is interesting for our inquiry into the paradox of the Romanesque capital. Even if in certain Romanesque buildings the system of pairs survived in the workshop, the point of the system, that is its aesthetic point, seems often to have been lost or ignored. At Anzy-le-Duc here in the Brionnais, capitals are carved and set up in antiphonal pairs across the area of the sanctuary. Here are is one of two, this is the second, corresponding atlas capitals, which form a pair facing each other across the sanctuary. They're clearly the same theme. At Anzy, capitals continue to be carved in pairs for the slightly later nave. But here, the masons did not position them in corresponding pairs, but all over the place, as this plan shows. I've joined up the pairs, and you can see that they're placed haphazardly all over the place. No doubt the exigencies of the progress of building demanded a completed capital at each stage, and the pair was not ready. Or did the masons simply not understand the underlying raison d'etre of the system? At Vézelay in the nave there are even a few pairs. Here's one of them. But they are set far apart and in no way correspond to the late antique system. It is as if it has been totally forgotten. A notable case of a portal where the capitals were wrongly positioned by the masons is at Mont-sur-l'Étoile, a little parish church in the Brionnais. This is all the more interesting in that the sculpture is closely related in style and technique to the north portal at Vézelay. It is evident at Mont-sur-l'Étoile that the original intention for the portal capitals has been lost. What's more, the loss of programmatic sense is not here limited to answering the needs of the builders, to supplying capitals in order to maintain the progress of the building. The two capitals and the two corbels beneath the lintel have been set up in such a way as to contradict all sense. On the left side of the door, an angel attacks a devil with a sword, driving the devil in the direction of the interior of the church. We can be sure, however, that this scene, which had a certain popularity on doorways in southern Burgundy, was designed to display the exact opposite: the warrior angel obstructing the devil who is trying to enter the church. A version of the scene on a capital of the west door of the old Cathedral of Saint-Vincent at Mâcon bears an inscription which specifically identifies the theme, and you can see the inscription above the capital. I apologise for the quality of the slide, but I translation of the inscription: the demon tries to know whether he is forbidden from entering the church. The angel, armed with a sword, obstructs him. The corbel at Mont-sur-l'Étoile was clearly intended for the right side of the door. If we now mentally swap the two corbels of a door, the corbel with the angel obstructing the devil takes its originally intended place. The facing corbel, which represents a siren harpy, becomes, if we move it to the left, part of a complete scene, where it is attacked by a fawn satyr on the adjacent capital. And you can just make out where the corbel is in the right corner of the slide beneath the lintel. I hope that's clear. This theme of the siren and the harpy is also a familiar one in southern Burgundy. What all this implies is that from time to time the masons lost the original order of capitals, even on doorways. Whether this would suggest a gap in time between the carving of the capitals and their erection is one question. Another is, was the portal of Mont-sur-l'Étoile carved elsewhere and transported by other masons to its final resting place? The programme being forgotten in transit. Does the evidence suggest that we should treat the multitude of capitals in the nave at Vézelay, and this is another question, as images on the edge? This concept of images on the edge is much discussed by art historians. The Bayeux tapestry provides the most famous and controversial example. It has given rise to books and vastly inflated ideas being formed about the nature of medieval art and medieval artists. The humorous, the lubricious, the exotic, the subversive make up the marginal world of so many of the, for instance, of the exterior corbel tables, as here at Anzy-le-Duc again. We are close to the world of the borders of manuscripts, or indeed of the Bayeux embroidery. But the subject matter of the historiated Vézelay nave capitals is something else. It is overwhelmingly scriptural, patristic, or hagiographic, with only a few examples of those humorous or exotic themes on the edge. The dominant mode is serious. For this reason, they belong, in my opinion, in a quite separate category. I will add a postscriptum to these remarks about the apparent pell-mell of capitals in the nave at Vézelay. One could suggest another cultural parallel. In his analysis of La Chanson de Roland, Erich Auerbach speaks of the direct confrontation of different scenes in the poem, just as we have them on adjacent capitals at Vézelay. He speaks of the, I quote, parcelled pictures, Bildparzellen, the paratactic structures of the, I quote, the juxtaposed and independent verbal blocks. We are here, after all, in the feudal world that saw the birth of the heroic epic in written form, the Chanson de Geste. It seems that the remarks applied here to the Vézelay nave capitals, and to the reading of capitals in general, may well be contradicted when it comes to discussing the decoration of the sanctuary of certain churches. Invariably, the central message at the east was found in the semidome of the main apse, a painting of some dominant image, such as the Majestas Domini and its variants. This is Edensen in Lower Saxony, by way of illustration. Absidioles and radiating chapels, often ambulatory, must also have had, or been intended to have, some principal painted image. Most of the evidence of these main images, if it ever existed, has been lost, but we can, I believe, be sure that this was the underlying intention created by these architectural forms. It therefore remains an astonishing fact that the capitals of the sanctuary and the subsidiary chapels rarely, if ever, present any sort of coherent theme. This seems to apply in a sphere which reaches far beyond Burgundy, indeed from Scandinavia and the British Isles to Italy, the German lands and Spain. This incoherence in the distribution of subject matter seems to be the almost universal rule, even when a number of capitals treat the same theme. At Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, in the late 11th century, we find a set of 7 capitals related to the life and miracles of St. Benedict. They are set in the sanctuary, crossing and transept. Yet it's difficult to trace a coherence in their positions. 6 are set antiphonally across the sanctuary and crossing, but so high up that they're virtually invisible. A host of other apparently unrelated figured and foliage capitals, some purely decorative, very few historiated, make up the decoration of the eastern parts of the church. It's so evident to our eyes that the St. Benedict capitals could have been placed together or in sequences, for instance much closer up around the hemicycle of the apse, that we are at a loss for an explanation. At least it can be said that 6 of them are in positions to relate to the dedication of the main altar to St. Benedict. But if so, why are they not on the columns around the altar? Was there a vault painting over the choir, in the vault of the choir which you see here? Perhaps there was, with an image of St. Benedict, to which the high capitals related. Typical, and indeed almost universal, seems to be a sort of anarchy. One example, the north absidiole of the transept of La Charité-sur-Loire, of late 11th century date, in the great church of the elder daughter of Cluny. It has arcading and window colonnettes, decorated with foliage capitals, and a series of capitals with grotesque heads, as here, and beasts more or less fantastic, and with no discernible purpose other than to beautify, to quote again Lucas of Tuy. If the capitals in these subsidiary spaces were to present a message, it would surely be related to an altar dedication. But examples of this are extremely rare. The 8 famous capitals of Cluny III, of circa 1095 to 1110, pose a different set of problems. They decorated reused antique marble columns, forming the apse hemicycle. The first thing to be noted is that the order in which they are originally set up is unknown. Kenneth Conant's perfected plan, which I show you, imposes an intellectual programme on the capitals which cannot be justified. Neither the subject matter nor the disposition of the capitals is more than a fallacious hypothesis, and he's introduced as respond capitals 2 historiated capitals which were never part of this ensemble. In fact, the 8 capitals fall into groupings of 3 pairs. Come again to this question of pairs, and to singletons, 2 of them. I will not argue this here in detail, but I show you one of the pairs. First, a female figure holding a casket, here. Then, a figure holding a whip, with the remains of a little figure on the right edge of the mandorla. As to the subject matter, suffice to say that it's certain that some of the identifying inscriptions were wrongly placed. This figure of Grammar, with her whip chastising a pupil, was identified by Émile Malle quite correctly. It's obviously grammar, one of the cardinal virtues. However, originally it was given a painted inscription, referring to another of the cardinal virtues, prudence. We know this because Kenneth Conant saw it and recorded it before it faded away, the painted inscription. The same inscription, referring to prudence, was later carved around a figure on another side of the same capital. What's more, this latter figure is dressed in armour and can scarcely match her prudential role. Clearly confusion reigned at the moment when the capitals were put in place. These capitals were never, of course, seen in isolation as they are today in a museum. The apse of Cluny 3 was decorated, above all, with an enormous painting, in part in mosaic, the background. This is the mediocre engraving we have of it. I've cheated and reversed the image, as the published engraving is itself reversed. The semidome of the apse presented Christ in majesty with the four evangelists, and at the feet of Christ the Agnus Dei. There is uncertainty over the interpretation of some of the themes shown on the 8 capitals. Clearly, there were virtues, or maybe the liberal arts, the 4 seasons, the 4 winds. But what is certain is that whatever the precise themes shown, they were taken from the well-established series, often quaternions, so popular in the Romanesque period. And here at Cluny they performed a role very similar to that found on certain mosaic pavements in sanctuaries. Particularly in northern Italy, for instance at Aosta, Ivrea and Pavia, as well as in the German lands, we find sanctuary pavements with similar subject matter: the theological and cardinal virtues, the liberal arts, the rivers of paradise, the 4 seasons, the 4 winds, and other roles in sequences, sometimes quaternions, sometimes also zodiacal. In the Italian pavements, as at Cluny, these allegories are presented in relation to a main image, acting in a subordinate role, a peripheral commentary on the principal message. And in Gaul, 2 Romanesque mosaic pavements, now largely destroyed, adopted the same sort of layout at Saint-Irénée de Lyon and at Saint-Rémy de Reims, and I show you Xavier Barral's schematic plan of the Reims choir mosaic, which we know from 16th century descriptions, where various series, the cardinal virtues, liberal arts, seasons, rivers of paradise, and so on, surround a central field. However, whatever the underlying programme planned for the Cluny hemicycle, it can be positively asserted that some of the inscriptions on the capitals were wrongly placed, and one was even duplicated in paint, either before or after it was inscribed on another capital. Another face of the same capital bears an inscription referring to spring, yet the figure in question cannot possibly represent one of the 4 seasons, being a woman who holds a book. This is an image totally irrelevant to the iconographic tradition of the 4 seasons. In fact, another of the 8 capitals could indeed represent the 4 seasons, although it's too mutilated to be certain of this attribution. It seems that the masons didn't know to which figure the spring inscription was meant to apply. This is astonishing in the sanctuary of the Abbey Church of Cluny. Cluny was a centre of learning with a colossal library. It underlines once again one of the factors which make our interpretation of Romanesque art so difficult. The sculptors were undoubtedly, in certain cases, unlettered. They did not always understand the inscriptions which were handed out to them by a literatus. And I show you here one of 2 collections of verses known to me, this one in the library in Angers, and of about 1200. There seems every likelihood that such florilegia were collected by the monks with a view to being used as inscriptions. Here, in the Angers manuscript, the hexameter inscribed on the capital at Cluny and referring to spring occurs at the fourth line from the bottom. Ver lapsat, quod stringit hiems, it starts. But to transfer such a verse to a carved inscription, probably via a parchment cartoon, could create problems. Remarkable proof of a mason's illiteracy can be found at Vézelay, on a capital in the narthex, where two inscriptions have been copied in reverse. The identifying tituli of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau were no doubt traced out on parchment for copying. The parchment was inadvertently reversed by the sculptor in the act of carving, for the first two figures, but not for the third. Whether or not the role of the Cluny apse capitals represents a more widespread vogue, it is difficult to judge. Certainly the apse hemicycle is a place where subsidiary themes in series can be found commenting on a principal image, and I show you again the bad engraving of the Cluny apse painting. At Mozart, in the Auvergne, for instance, there seem to have been subsidiary themes similar to those at Cluny. This is the Mozart apse capital with the four angels and the four winds, but the apse no longer exists. It's been taken down and survived, but the apse itself doesn't exist. But so many east ends of these abbey churches were rebuilt in the late Middle Ages, indeed at Mozart. Also, there is another tendency, hard to pinpoint, which seems to appear from time to time in the sanctuary. There can be a preference for foliage or purely decorative themes around the main altar, and I show you again this hemicycle capital at Paris-le-Monial. It would be interesting to examine how far this tendency was general. These thoughts on the paradox of the Romanesque capital have taken as their starting point two great Burgundian Cluniac monuments. Cluny and Vézelay were exceptional, even in their own day, and to generalise from them is dangerous. Everybody who takes an interest in Romanesque art will wish to modify or challenge some of the general conclusions presented here. What about such and such a monument, you will ask? Some of you will be unconvinced, and of course every zone of Romanesque Europe has its own language of images. Yet, and in spite of certain exceptions, the general questions which apply to Cluny and Vézelay recur everywhere. Thank you so much for listening.